Marlowe's complaint, there you go, finally. So I decided to tackle Mendenhall because so many people have made reference to him over the years, and I myself have, and actually when I first read Hoffman's book, it just blew me away that there was a fellow in the 19th century who had figured out how to chart, the usage of words, and then suddenly, bang, there was the signature. And I thought to myself, gosh, isn't there a repository for all this information? Isn't there somebody that has dug into this thing and opened it up for us? Because according to Hoffman and according to Mendenhall, they studied almost 2 million plus words over several dozen texts. And my God, wouldn't that be a valuable resource? And sure enough, no, there's nothing of the kind. And so I thought to myself, is there a way in which I could take a text and turn it into a column of words and then hand count it myself? Because as it was explained by Mendenhall, that's sort of what they did. And is there a way that I could abbreviate the process? And I was talking with my brother John about this. He works in Huntsville, Rocket City, so he knows how to use Excel and stuff. And he said, yeah, there's a formula for that. It's a piece of cake. I said, oh, really? Okay. So basically what I did, now I have a little detail in here about the history of Mendenhall and Hoffman's in here and some other folks, and I might just skip all that because I think what you really are going to be interested in is the stuff that I dug up myself. But as you know, there's our friend Mr. Mendenhall. He was hired by Ohio State College before it was Ohio State University. He was a physicist back in the day when physicists were still studying the raw earth. To consider what physics was in 1873 when he was hired, they still hadn't invented the electromagnet yet. That wasn't until 1880. So there's a long way to go in physics, and when he got started, it was really a sort of grubby thing. But for Ohio, where you're growing wheat and corn, that's what they wanted to start their college with. He eventually became the Secretary of Weights and Measures, reporting to the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, and he established in 1893 that the metric system would be used for all weights and measures in scientific measurement in the United States. What a forward-thinking guy. Now, he published in 1887, which is why he's interesting to us, this thing called The Characteristic Curves of Composition. And he compared 10,000 words of excerpts from Dickens, Thackeray, and John Stuart Mill. And what he was trying to do, what his theory was, and he said he got this, he was going to chart it on a graph, and he got the idea from an Englishman, Augustus de Morgan, a perfectly good English name, and he was a professor of mathematics at the London School for Mathematics, who hypothesized that it might be possible to come up with an author's signature if you counted all the letters in the words that he uses and then took an average per word. And it was Mendenhall's theory that, you might end up with a number that would have an endless decimal point, and it would be very cumbersome. So what he wanted to do, and he was thinking in terms of the spectrograph, which was brand new at the time, he was thinking, wouldn't it be easier to chart it according to the number of words in a stack? So if you had so many 3-letter words, so many 2-letter words, so many 1, and just see what you get. And so that's what he did. And he came up with this comparison of Dickens and Thackeray and John Stuart Mill. And this was what he published in 1883. And he noted that Dickens and Thackeray both had a preference for 3-letter words, which then tapered off kind of smoothly, but you could see some sort of difference. Now, he was only working with 10,000 word samples because, again, they had to do this by hand. They had to pick up the text and go, that one's 4, that one's 7, that one's, and write it all down, and then, it's drive you nuts. So how many is enough, and all of that. But this is what he did initially in 1883. And he discovered an interesting thing, that John Stuart Mill peaked at 2 letters. Now this is because Stuart Mill was more of an ethicist and more of a philosopher, and he used a lot of short words to link together all his ideas. I don't know what the real explanation is. This is what his hypothesis was. Who knows why this happened, but that's what happened. He saw, well, maybe, he said, maybe it would be possible to note that if there were striking differences between the curves of composition, then you could eliminate somebody from consideration. You could certainly do that. You might not be able to absolutely identify, but you could certainly eliminate. So John Stuart Mill didn't write Dickens. It was easy to say for him. Well, the matter sort of rested there until 1901, when a certain man by the name of Augustus Hemingway and his beautiful wife Harriet. This man was a philanthropist in Boston, and you know what a philanthropist is. The guy inherits a lot of money and gives most of it away. And he had this lovely wife Harriet, who was painted half a dozen times by John Singer Sargent. So they were dripping with cash, and that's one of her earlier portraits. Hemingway was an advocate for Sir Francis Bacon as being the alternative author, and he hired Mendenhall to prove or disprove the theory. And Mendenhall went out and he got two women to help him. And I had thought that this was a room full of people, but it turned out that it was two highly energetic people who divided the work up by the one woman would read the letters of each word, and the other one would type it down. And they could do this at a ferocious clip for about 5 hours a day. And they did this over 3 months, and they did the entire first folio. And they did 400,000 words of Sir Francis Bacon. My God! Now, what they found was that Bacon didn't match this Mr. Shakespeare. They didn't match at all. But what he also found was something that he thought was highly peculiar. Shakespeare is the dotted line here, and Bacon is, and by the way, Bacon, he's a very good writer. I'd never read any of Bacon, but when I started doing this, I started doing a little reading of Bacon. He's lovely. You really should check him out. He's a lot of fun. And it's easy to see why people would think, well, this guy's so good, it could have been Shakespeare. Just what was he doing in this? He was a pretty busy guy. I don't know how he would have fitted in. But anyway, the point being that the striking characteristic was that Shakespeare peaked at 4 letters, which was very unusual for all the other people that he was looking at. And when they started comparing other writers, people like Johnson and Fletcher and so forth, they all peaked at 3. And they weren't getting any kind of match at all until they got to Marlowe. Now, you can't even see the difference. Now, so they had 600,000 words of Shakespeare. We'll call him Mr. Shakespeare, okay? and then they had, for Marlowe, they had the texts of Marlowe, which amounts to somewhere between 150,000 and 75,000, depending upon which plays you choose. And I'll explain to you why I chose the ones I did later, but very soon. But at any rate, he admits that he had to kind of skew the tables a little bit because, with so many more words of Shakespeare than Marlowe, you have to kind of compress. In other words, you get a square that's 10,000 by 10,000, and for Shakespeare you get one that's 60,000 by 60,000. So you have to kind of squeeze one on top of the other to make sure that they line up. But by doing that, he then saw Marlowe and Shakespeare both peaked at 4. And that was all he had to say about it. That's where he left it. And that was, it just sat there for forever. Along comes a guy, Dr. Carrington Bonser Williams, an Englishman. He picked up on what Mendenhall was doing in the 40s, but he didn't write anything about his interest in this until the 70s. But he made 2 statements in his article in the 70s which were important. He said that the length of the sentence is under conscious control of the writer. However, the selection of the words for reason of their length would be unconscious. So they were looking for an unconscious signature. This whole thing was supposed to be free of bias, and purely nuts and bolts. So you would have no influence by the bias of the researcher or anybody doing the work. And this seemed to be a pretty good set of principles. It seemed to be a very strong verification of what Mendenhall was up to. And then, of course, down the road we come to our guy Calvin. He's an angry-looking fellow, isn't he? But he claimed to have exhumed Mendenhall. He was unaware of Bonser Williams, and in his book, which he has in chapter 17, he reports on Mendenhall. And Mendenhall's articles are pretty short, so there's not a lot of further information provided by Hoffman either, but he does give the charts, and he does make the point that Marlowe and Shakespeare are like right on top of each other. And this was what I read in 1970, and I was just like, after first 16 chapters of him explaining to me why Marlowe had written the work, and then he throws this fastball at you, you really are like sold. At that point, you're sold, because now there's scientific evidence. Well, A.D. Rate finally republished Bonser Williams' article on Mendenhall in her book, The Story That the Sonnets Tell, in 1993. And in her book, including this article, which Williams' article is a good 10 pages long, and he really examines a lot of what Mendenhall was up to in both of Mendenhall's articles. Rate says, no one's ever really followed up with this, and why not? And this is kind of like the kick in my butt to get it going, because I was thinking, yeah, why not? I mean, it's now 100 years later or more, and computers have moved a long way, and it's no longer two women sitting at a table shouting at each other. You can shout at your own screen now. So do it that way. So, but somebody got there before me. You might know him. And in Marlowe's Goes, Darrell Pinkston attacked the problem, and he also did Ben Jonson at some length. And on this, you can see, now my book, this is clipped straight out of his book, and I have the paperback version. So I think he intended in the hardcover, if there was one, that these would be printed in color. But what you get is individual plays by Jonson here, and they skew differently. But what his basic point is that Jonson, again, is peaking at 3. So Jonson is not Shakespeare, and he's not Marlowe. And Darrell had a lot of other arguments to make in his book, and so he didn't dwell on it, but it was very good. And he said, this, at the very least, this proves that Marlowe cannot be excluded. And so, well, I was sitting explaining this to a friend of mine one day, and she asked me, so how many other writers did they look at? And I thought, well, come to think of it. And then I thought, okay, what is the minimum, if I want to do this, what is the minimum number of words I need to do in order? Because I'm not going to do 600,000 words. That's just inconceivable. Even though I can streamline it down so I can do, let's say, a play of 25,000 words, I can get that done in about 3 hours. There's a lot of stuff that you still have to do by hand, because you got to clean up stuff. And you have to make up your own mind what you're going to clean up. Am I going to keep, for instance, all the character names? When the speech says, "What ho, you jaded kings of Asia," are you going to include Tamerlane at the front end of that? Because that guy's in the play a lot. So you want to eliminate that. So you do a search and replace to replace that. And then you be consistent, you replace all the other people as well. But you leave Tamerlane in there when somebody says, "Tamerlane, drop dead." You leave that in, because that's fair game. But if you're going to do that, then shouldn't you also eliminate all the stage directions? Because even though maybe Marlowe did write some of them, sometimes there are other people who get their hands on it. And I'm not even talking about modern editors. I'm talking about, when Shakespeare was cleaning up backstage and he was trying to remember who was going to make the next entrance, he'd make a little note. And that note ended up getting printed in a quarto somewhere. Now, is that him writing a play? No, but by God, he's going to spoil the sample if I leave that in. So, but then still, how many words do I need? Do I need to do 500,000 words? What do I need to do? Well, here's a couple more examples from Pinkston. There's a fellow by the name of Maciej Eder who runs an institute in Poland, and they are actually dedicated to the study of this subject. They actually have money to do this. And so they've been working with not just the question of Shakespeare, they've been working with a lot of other texts as well. So they have a broad field of experience in all different languages. And he says, you know, if you're doing Greek, you need 2,000 words. If you're doing Latin, you need at least 3,000 words, because you can't get a good sample without that. For English, 5. 5. Thank you. 5. Five's a good number, because a play is somewhere between 17 and 20 on average. That's why when they did the folio, it was 600,000 words, because there are 32 plays in a folio. By last count, I don't know. So okay, so now I've figured out how I'm going to do this. I'm going to throw them into a column. I'm going to eliminate all the garbage. I'm going to put it into Excel, and I'm going to let it count it, and then I'm going to do subtotals, and then I'm going to make a chart. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And the first thing I want to know is, can I find what Mendenhall found? Can I do that first? Can I establish that what Mendenhall said would happen? You know, I mean, the accuracy of a scientific statement is it can be repeated by an independent using the same tools. Well, I don't have, but I do have Word and I do have Excel. So here we go. 3 letters, 4 letters. Bang on. Love, Slavery's Lost. Now, this is the modern art inversion, which is going to be a topic. Pay attention. And this is the Wisdom of the Ancients, which is I think it's just wonderful. It's all of the old stories, about Prometheus and all this stuff. And he writes it in such a wonderful way. It's so like, well, all these old folks, they really believed this, and you don't have to believe it. But let me tell you this story because it's really fun. And then he goes and tells you all these stories about all these people. Great stuff, but sorry, not Shakespeare. Okay, now I have an agenda. Mind you, I have an agenda because if I can get past this point, I'm all in. So the next thing I want to do is Marlowe and Shakespeare. Now these plays, okay, so we have, what the hell is MP? What the hell would the MP be? Huh? I know, Edward II, Faust. Which one is that? Massacre of Paris, that's right, of course, yes, stupid me. And Tamerlane 1 and 2, and that ends up to be just about 80,000 words. And on the flip side, you take Richard II, Comedy of Errors, Taming of the Shrew, Midsummer, and Henry IV, Part 1. Okay, and that's about 96,000 letters. And these are, more or less contemporary in time. These predate these by, I think some of these actually can be moved back, but these are in the 90s and these are in the late 80s, early 90s. Okay, and that's a match.
That's amazing.
Okay, I'm done. No.
Is there any way maybe later we can just overlay these?
My next trick was that I wanted to find out about the unattributed plays, because this is when I really go to work. And I want to know, do these look like Marlowe or Mr. Shakespeare? And, well, they're peaking at 4, aren't they? This is pretty good. I'm having fun now. So then I move on, and this is when I hit a bump in the road, because having established that there was a commonality between the unattributed plays and Marlowe and Shakespeare, etc., I then wanted to expand my net a little bit and take a look at some of the other writers from the same period. Now we only have, and I deliberately chose these two guys because one, they have a few plays, not a bunch of them, so we can't have an argument over which play you should have chosen. And two, they're at the other end of the scale as far as, would they have known Marlowe or would they have known Shakespeare? Were they operating at the front end or the tail end of that period of time when those plays by those two guys were being written? So we have Spanish tragedy. And wait a minute, it's peaking at 4. And we have Duchess of Malfi. And hang on, it's peaking at 4. No, I'm not happy. And it's very interesting, by the way. Webster, I got to tell you, he gave me the most trouble of all. Because one of the things that, I wanted to do when I was setting up my columns was eliminate all the punctuation. So colons, semicolons, commas, blah, 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 that all gets tossed out. Except when you get to Webster, and I made the decision that I was going to leave in apostrophes because, shortened words and so forth, if you put the apostrophe and you take it out, it's practically the same word anyway, and the count doesn't change until you get to Webster and every third word is apostrophized. This guy has an absolute tick for apostrophes, and you can't, and by the way, when I just stole it right offline, every apostrophe was followed by a space. So, I have to go in and then close the words up if I'm going to take out, it was a nightmare. I hate you! So I might not be wholly accurate about this guy, but I'm definite that he's not Shakespeare or Marlowe because there are more apostrophes than words in here. But darn it all, now I've got this guy counting at 4, and they did share a room, so maybe something happened. I don't know, but I'm not very happy about this at all. Now I move on to George Chapman. Well, thank you, George, but he's a terrible writer. He's awful, and Bussy d'Amboise is almost, horrible, bad play. But he breaks but it's very narrow. It's very narrow. And then I go to Johnson, and I get the same sort of figure and Johnson, can talk. Johnson can talk. He's got the second longest word in the English language, which I love. In one breath utterable. I love it. This is why I kept the hyphens in, because that word is so, it's way the hell out here. It doesn't do anything, but it's great. But now Johnson is an interesting, because now I'm starting to ask myself, is there something about iambic pentameter that might be causing the difference between 3 and 4? Is there something about that? Because every man in his humor is prose. This guy's an awful writer, and he can write anything that it all sounds like crap. So he can't, he doesn't count. But Kidd is writing fairly competent iambic pentameter, and so is Webster for all his apostrophes. And they're peaking at 4. But when Johnson chooses to write in prose, he's peaking at 3. And so is Bacon. They're peaking at 3. And I'm just, I wonder. Well, so I take a look at Sejanus, which is iambic pentameter. Well, holy cow, there's a 4. And then I take a look at the masks, and Johnson wrote 4 masks. So I lump them all together. And they're kind of semi-poetic, but they're not in a fixed meter because they range all over the place. He throws in songs, he throws in, one-offs, he does all kinds of snappy stuff. And so basically, he very sharply at 3 there. And so you can see when you put all of Johnson together, you end up with somebody that peaks at 3 because he's doing so many different things. You really have to focus on the individual piece in order to pull this out. But I'm still not wholly convinced, that the iambic pentameter is really the controlling thing here. I'm not completely convinced until I go to Robert Greene. One must always return to Robert Greene. Orlando Furioso is a short play. It's only 10,000 words, but it's double what Maciater told me to get, and it peaks at 4, and it's in pentameter. And then I've got, you might have heard of this, Green's Growth Worth. It's all in prose. It peaks at 3. That's just true. And so I'm beginning to think that when Winslow said that an author's word choice would not be conscious, he wasn't thinking in terms of iambic pentameter when you have 10 syllables and you make physical choices of words in the syllable range that you have. There's a very tight pattern to make it work. And so it means something for you to pick one word over another. Now, the Langdon Boys School also got involved in this little project with me. Chris Taylor had written something to me earlier back in September. Can you think of a project? And it wasn't just me, he was writing to me, he wrote to a few other people, but I was in the chain. And I said, yeah, it would be fun if they could help me out and do some counting. And here's the way I'd like to go about it. But the thing that I didn't tell them, because I sort of changed the way I was doing things, and I went back and redid them after I'd done most of them, or some of them anyway. But the boys were still working with the original instruction set. So I didn't tell them to take out all of the names. And I didn't tell them to take out all the stage directions. So I did Tamerlane on my own because I had heard from them for a while and I wasn't sure, are they keeping up? What's going on? And then all of a sudden they sent me their version of Tamerlane. And when I did the tally, lo and behold, it broke at 3, but mine broke at 4. What? Well, the difference is about 1,500 words, which is what we call the stage directions. And that's all it takes. That's all it takes to throw this thing into another category altogether. So I feel like at this point, my theory has got pretty solid ground. It makes a difference if you're writing an iambic pentameter. And this is not something that Mendenhall saw, because he didn't reach far enough, because his tools were, they were cumbersome, and I'm afraid his team wore out. Okay, now, I lied to you, because it's not the first thing that I did. The first thing that I did when I sat down to do this was, after I consulted with Maciater, I said to myself, if I'm going to try to replicate what Mendenhall did, I need to know what plays he was working with. He tells us the folio, he tells us this, but he doesn't tell us specifically plays, and he doesn't tell us specifically the editions. Why would that matter, I wonder? Why would it matter, except that I'm the kind of guy that says I want to work with the source closest to the writer. I want to get to the one that the guy, when it left his hands, it was the first time he let it go. And if somebody else got their hands on it, I can try to make a correction for that. But if you move down the road several hundred years from where this guy first wrote it, and you have all of these editions, could things happen to it? I don't know. But the first thing I did was, and for Shakespeare, you can do this. You can get copies, literal copies of the original quartos with all their misspellings and all their cranky editing and all the rest of it. You can get that. And if you're going to test that versus somebody who has politely corrected the spelling for you, shouldn't you do that? And what would that do? And by the way, would that help you know which one Mendenhall was working with when he found this surprising thing? Well, okay, I did. And this is what I found. I took all the original quartos that I could find for these plays, and these are the plays that are in the Gutenberg versions, which are 19th century versions edited, the Gutenberg. And they're what we call normalized, okay? And these are, cold. And, oh my God, it's peaking at 3. Oh my God, Oh my God, it's peaking at 4 over here, and it's peaking at, these are the same plays, ladies and gentlemen. So that's a bit of a, so in order to do all the prior slides here, I reverted to using the 19th century versions that I was certain that Mendenhall had used. But now I'm also keeping in the back of my mind that, wait a minute, there's a difference here, and Mendenhall might never have found anything at all if he understood what he was looking at. So now we take Henry VI, and it's not part one. It's not part one. It's just Henry VI, or Henry IV. It's not part one. It's just Henry IV. When it was first published, it wasn't part one. It was Henry. And then we get to the Arden version, you know, Catherine Duncan Jones, and she'd done all this work on it, make it clean, good for modern readers and stuff. But, I mean, I'm sorry, somebody changed something. Now, if you're telling me that I'm supposed to be looking for somebody's signature, that this is supposed to be a signature, and then somebody has gone in and manipulated the internals of it so that I get another signature altogether, well, I don't know if I can trust this at all. I don't think, I mean, where am I? Now I went further with this. Here's the original Richard III. Well, that peaks at 4. That's a good one. Here's the first folio version. That peaks at 4. That, yeah, well, okay. I mean, you know, I can live with that if that's what I'm supposed to be looking for. But would you see the difference here? You see how forcefully it peaks at 4 as opposed to these guys which kind of just get to the top of Everest and then leave? This is really jumping. And changes are being made. Changes are fundamentally being made. And they could tell you, I'm just cleaning it up. But if you're thinking, what was the writer thinking? What was in his mind when he was putting words on the page? It wasn't that. So, now what? This is my favorite. I'm convinced, of course, the Taming of a Shrew is the predecessor to Taming of the Shrew, and the Arden version of the Shrew. And a Shrew peaks at 3. The Shrew in the folio peaks at 3. And over here, it peaks at 3, but just barely. Just barely. Whereas, you know, now we're talking about the shift of several hundred words. I mean, in this case, we've added, I can't quite read that because it overlaps so much, but there's 712 versus 37. 4,037 versus 4,712. They found almost 700 additional 4-letter words as a result of their editing process. They found them, just like votes in Georgia. How real is it? Okay, we're getting to my summation. What is going on? And I start to think more expansively, and I don't want to try to generalize too much off of the foundation laid here. But, you know, Mendenhall is one of the first people to go at this kind of idea of how to tackle the authorship problem by divorcing the actual text from itself and treating it as if it was some kind of molecule that you're going to find out, is it hydrogen or helium, as opposed to just seeing what it does. And you know, is it the question of, when we're observing these changes, is it because they're writing poetry versus prose? Is that what's doing it? I mean, that's an editorial decision, isn't it? But at least the author, we assume, is making that decision. Is it the editorial changes that are made at a later date, which seem to want to normalize things? And I would say their idea of normalization is to push away from poetry, because the common man, the ordinary reader, if you throw a poem in his face, goes, rah, you know, woo, I can't read that stuff. You know, it's like, and I believe me, when I quote in my book, I say, please read this part of the poem, they skip it. They skip it. And so modern editors are, they can't help it. They do that. And so that's where you go. Is this an issue of multiple hands? Do we have, and who are the multiple hands? I mean, are we talking about collaborators from way back with Kidd? Is this a situation where Marlowe supposedly collaborated with Kidd on Geronimo and that's why? Is that what happened? Or is it many later doing their thing? Could you tell? Could you tell? If you were going to do it so granularly that you could decide why this word was picked over that word. If you had two columns and you went through and you said, well, wait, he stuck that in. Why did he do that? I don't know. Is it a flawed hypothesis? Is this whole thing? And let's think about this for a minute. The idea that you can separate an author from what an author has written, that you can find a mystery inside the mystery that will explain the genesis of the mystery. And whether you're doing this with Mendenhall's method, stylometrics, engrams, or some other kind of coded theory, aren't you really just removing the writer altogether? And doesn't that become an alternate reality that then by itself engenders its own rules and creates its own kind of context, which is separate from what the writer intended? The writer never had any idea that you would look at his work this way. Why would you? He's telling you what he's telling you. Why do you insist on looking somewhere else when he's telling you who I am? And so I would reject all of these things. I would say, who is this Shakespeare? Is he the guy from Stratford? Is he the editor at Arden? Is he Christopher Marlowe? There's only one way to find out. There's only one way to find out. Do you study the text like it was a spectrograph and look to see the shadows cast on the wall? Do you create an alternate reality using all of these tricks and hand jumps and handsprings in order to figure out something that the author wasn't paying attention to at all? Or do you just read what he says about himself? And whenever you come across something that you think you don't understand, don't throw it away as if it meant nothing. Remember that what he's saying is the authority, and when you stand and say, but it doesn't make sense in accordance with my preconceived notion of what this is supposed to be, who's wrong in this room? Who's wrong in this room? It's the guy who has the preconceived notion. It's not the guy who did the writing. Read the story that he has to tell, and if you need help doing that, I've got the guy. Okay? I've got the guy. The last thing, it just occurred to me, when you look at something like Shakespeare's sonnets and A Lover's Complaint, because they go together, they're a whole piece. Try to remember that Shakespeare's sonnets, that was the last thing that was written. That all the sonnets and A Lover's Complaint came first. And they wrapped it in a cover and sold it to you. Now get rid of the cover and read the sonnets. What they tell you. Think of them as if he starts and he writes to the end. It's not a jumble. It's not an acrostic. It's not a science experiment. It's a letter. Read the letter. Questions?
Okay. Can I throw in first bit? I have to explain a bit. There's a couple of kind of moderators one would like to play with. I mean, one is time. It would be, from a provenance point of view, you'd expect some evolution of a writer's style. So one's tempted to check, say, The Tempest versus coming at the end versus one of the early ones. And say, well, do we get a change in that ratio, in that 3 number or whatever, 3 peak? The second moderator, one would like to look at will be genre. I mean, the difference between tragedy or a history play and a comedy particularly. And this, I guess, also comes up with Gary Taylor's study. So any comments on anything there?
Yes,
either those three, or even a comment on Gary Taylor?
yes. Okay, I don't think that a writer maturing over the years and having that reflected in the source text as generating different words and different usages and so forth, I mean, that's probably a natural process. I don't think that that's going to become so strong in itself to be identifying in any real sense. And by that I mean that while you're spending your time studying your navel, why don't you read what he wrote? You know, if the writer starts out in mid-century, 20th century, and his experience of life is the Great Depression, and then he writes a book on the Great Depression, and then he goes off to war and fights in World War II and subsequently, and then comes home and writes a book about the war. You have a very different writer at that point, at least in terms of what he's writing about and why he chooses to write. So there are things that happen over time, and I think more powerfully are going to be reflected in what he says than in what the detritus of his word choices and intermixing and choosing metaphors and so on. I just don't think that stuff carries the weight, and you wouldn't care about any of it if you knew who wrote it in the first place. There wasn't an argument. Now, the second thing having to do with genre, actually, I think when you write comedy, you write in prose. And when you write tragedy, you write in poetic meter. And there is where your genre comes into play, because there's a tendency, and if you look at Johnson, who freely mixes them, you can see that if I throw a little prose in, it tilts the thing. Whereas if I stick strictly to the meter, I come out with one set of words that appears to peak at 4. Or if I split that atom a little bit and throw in a little bit more funny business, I mean, we know that a lot of comic bits were cut out of Tamerlane. Well, who knows? There might have been enough to tilt Tamerlane even, and he seems pretty firmly in the category of peaking at 4. But if you take all that stuff out, that fun stuff, if you put it back in, you might find out, oh no, there it goes, it peaks at 3. You only need a couple hundred words to make that change. So let's not fool ourselves that these things don't matter. And genre is not, it's not a question of can you compare a Shakespeare version of Henry with, or Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors, which was Marlowe's, with Tamerlane. It's, you know, first of all, Tamerlane is hilarious. It's hilarious. He killed another 10,000. You don't think the audience didn't correct their ass on that one? You know, it's just, there's more bodies on stage than we can squeeze on. It's just, that's hilarious. So, no, comedy is everywhere you find it, and I don't think the genre argument holds, except to say that it's an indicator of whether or not we're dealing with poetry, iambic pentameter, or prose.
Okay. So basically, provenance of the author trumps stylistics here.
Absolutely.
A question over there. What was your name again?
Alistair.
Alistair.
Commenting, thanks very much for doing all this hard work. Because I think it's important with an exercise where if you carry on doing the work, the truth is what it is rather than what we want it to be. And it's, especially for a society like this, it's important to get told things which aren't what we want the answers to be, as well as those which are. So thanks for that bit. Second thought is I think you're absolutely right that the style of what's being written can govern it. I can see how word counts can be quite a powerful indicator of an author for pure prose, which doesn't have an external structure imposed on it. Different writers will write in different ways. Once you go to poetry, you got a bit of structure imposed on it externally. once you go to iambic pentameter, gosh, it's pretty well rammed in a straitjacket. So I can see, I could imagine why the tool would work for pure prose, not work so well for poetry, and not work at all for iambic
The
pentameter.
Polish group that Eder heads primarily deals in prose, but they do a lot, interestingly enough, in other languages than English, as you can imagine. And they have written a lot of papers on Latin derivations and even the Greek. And when you're working with Latin and Greek, you're working with words that are much more compressed than English words. Where changing a letter in a word will change the entire angle and intention of a word, and so the English language has adapted in the opposite direction to give you a greater functionality by elaborating and making more room for clarification in that way. So if you were trying to do just Mendenhall's trick with Latin, I think you're going to run afoul of things because so many Latin words are all, they're compressed, and so what do you get? They're all going to look like that. But anyway, I'm not an expert in it. I've only just done this little piece, and that's all I know. Yeah.
Has anybody ever tried Gorbaduck? Because if you want to do, is it pentameter or prose, Gorbaduck is the absolute dum-da-dum-da-dum-da-dum. It is utterly and totally drum-beat regular. It's got the strongest bass line, if you like, of any playing, because of being the first one. It's absolutely,
Well, I tell you,
And so doing a sort of scientific prediction, if it's prose versus poetry, I would expect Gorbaduck to have a massive peak at 4 if it's IP that causes
Well,
the fall.
you might. You might run into the. Is Gorbaduck iambic pentameter?
Oh, absolutely! It's the most regular.
Okay. Well, I can give that a shot. I mean, it's not something I really want to. I was satisfied when I found out what I found out. In other words,
I think it would be a good test case.
Yeah. Well, I'll explain to you how I did it, and then you. How many words is Gorbaduck? Can you get an unedited original?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. Tony Briggs's book does a huge amount on Gorbaduck,
Yes,
because he sees it as the first slightly crude plain verse that gradually actually evolves towards Hamlet. It's even got similar stage directions and so on. But so there's a big theme. So it would be a great one to do if you could do it. I mean, I reckon.
Sure. It's not like I got nothing else to do. All right, I'll set it up on the plane going back. I'll have it for you.
I'm beginning to get a bit worried about my time because I want to get one more in before you get a cup of tea. Any last question though, or whatever? Am I up to time, Jen? I'm slightly behind, I think. But I'm a little behind because I need to squeeze one more in. I was going to do Cynthia in and then give you a cup of tea, but I'm slightly running late. So any last question? And but if not, Peter, thank you very much coming all this way, and that's certainly food for thought. And I think the final line is don't